if you're an insurance leader listening to this, what is just the single thing, the single one thing in the next 30 days that they should be doing at the start of 2026?
There's a phrase that I remember from the 80s that's very relevant now, and American listeners will remember this more because it was on American television. But there was a thing in the 80s where they would get a celebrity on the news and they would say, it's 10 p.m, do you know where your children are? The thing now that we have to think about is, it's 10 p.m, do you know where your data is?
Welcome to Building Tomorrow's Insurer, and today we are going to focus on the movement from agentic ambition to an operational reality in insurance. And I am joined maybe by the best man in the business to discuss this topic, and that is none other than Alex Taylor. I think he's got an unbelievable title. I'm going to try and get it right. He's Global Head of Emerging Tech at QBE Ventures. Alex, hopefully you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely correct.
Perfect. Alex, I'll let you intro yourself in just 1 second. I just want to provide a little bit of context. So, like right now, agentic AI, as you know, you're in the middle of it, is absolutely everywhere in insurance right now. But I think most insurers we've seen over the last couple of quarters are now starting to ask they're not actually asking what's possible anymore, they're actually asking what works. And I really want to dive into that today, really talk about the gap between ambition and execution and what has actually changed, what's changed in the last part of last year and what's really changing in this year. And so maybe, Alex, maybe I can let you to just kind of frame yourself up and why you're exactly at the epicenter of this change.
Yeah, then thank you so much, Nigel. It's great to be here. So look, as you heard before, so as the global head of emerging technology in a corporate venture capital unit, I've got quite a complex role of balancing both the interests of QBE as an insurer, as a multinational distributor of insurance products, and the investment side of what I do, which is finding the best and the brightest, creating the most amazing technology, and then melding the two together. Which is, of course, extremely complex. I think, as most people will know, insurance technology, at least in incumbents, tends to move quite slowly, whereas the world, as you pointed out, in AI, particularly in the last couple of years, and agentic AI, very particularly in the last 12 months, has moved tremendously rapidly. And there's a lot of FOMO, I think, looking over the fence saying, we would love to do these things if not for what we have over here. And a big part of what I do is for solving for that problem.
Super interesting. And so, Alex, let's just dive into it. And I want to try out a new thing today. And I'd like to see if we can just set the scene with 90 seconds of context. And so in 90 seconds, good guiding question for you. In 90 seconds, what is the real problem that insurers are trying to solve with emerging tech going into 2026? And why does it really matter now?
So look, there's a number of different ways of looking at this challenge, but look, I'm a big believer, and I've said in a number of forums, that insurers have underinvested in technology for probably the last generation. But there's a very good reason for that, in fact, and I was just talking to someone about this the other day. Insurance technology has always depended on stability and reliability at scale. And what that means in practice is that if your endorsement works in this product today, it will work tomorrow in the exact same way, and your customer will get a product that they can depend on. In the end, risk management and reliability is baked into the DNA of the insurance industry. And that's been fine, at least sort of since 1960-ish, when computers first started appearing in insurance. The challenge we have now is that technology is moving faster than our collective ability to acquiesce change. And what that means is that the technology that we find ourselves in the possession of still works. And look, mainframes are very good and they're still reliable, they're still effective, but it doesn't let you take advantage of the things that we suddenly want. And agentic AI is a particularly interesting case study. And that's because I think for the first time, we are replacing not something that's effectively a calculator, we're replacing something that a human brain has been unique at doing, and that is complex reasoning. And in the end, most of insurance operations in underwriting and in claims are complex reasoning. And the thought is, if we can do some of this with fewer people, we can have that reliability, we can have that effectiveness at a dramatically reduced cost. And that doesn't mean we take people out of the equation. Of course not. It means that those people can do things that people are still going to be very good at doing. And there's some case studies we'll look at today that point to some of the best and brightest doing that right now.
And great context. And maybe we can dial in a little bit there. You kind of talked around decision making within the business. How is the internal pressure? Like when you're inside, how's the internal pressure being? Is it cost, is it complexity, speed? Like where are these pressures coming from to think about these technologies, to implement them?
It's a great question. And it's interesting when you start to look over the fence at what your competitors are doing or what they might do, and therefore what you might need to do. And I've been saying this quite a lot recently, that it almost doesn't matter what your AI strategy does or doesn't do inside a major insurer. If it doesn't keep up with what those distributing alongside you do, then you're going to lose. And it's an important thing to recognize as you put your strategy together. And look, speed and accuracy have always been important, particularly in broker distributed products. And if we see one theme consistently across the last 15 years or so, risks themselves and the information we get about risks have been getting more complex. We have the most data as an industry that we have ever had about risks. And what that means is that a submission goes from something that's a few pages long to 50 to 100 to 200 pages, often in highly specific and esoteric areas. Cyber insurance is a great example, where underwriters know very accurately that if they can identify a rating factor, they can point towards an actuarial cause of loss, and they can rate for that, they can price for that. But they are not cybersecurity experts. They do not understand what it looks like to be on the tools and what drives that loss behind the scenes. Having something where you can very quickly and accurately understand a risk and price for a risk and communicate that risk to a customer is something that's very valuable. And for the first time, we've seen these hints in even some of the very early non-agentic generative AI tools that we can do that. And that means we can get back to a broker faster. We can tell the customer how we see their risk. We can have this back and forth dialogue without it taking weeks and weeks and weeks. Or worse, getting back to a broker only for them to say, actually, we've bound with one of your competitors because they were 3 days faster. And this is this race, I suppose, that we've got going on right now of making sure that we continue to serve our customers in a way they expect, but at the same time, making sure that we can keep up with the market.
Yeah, and do you think the customer expectation, the next kind of value part of the value chain on from the broker to the actual customer, is there, obviously we've always kind of said for the last 5 years, maybe a bit more, that the customer expectation in terms of the consumer applications they've been interacting with, Amazon, or the kind of e-commerce sites have got so good that there's that expectation on a user experience within insurance. It feels like that's just gone up a notch in terms of a customer expectation. Is that something that you're kind of thinking about within the business?
Absolutely. And look, in the end, I mean, I don't think customers care about AI at all. In fact, they certainly don't. What they care about is value and effectiveness. And if you can demonstrate to your customers that you can give them the product that they want, but it's easier for them to understand, they have to do less direct work in order to communicate the nature of their business or the nature of their personal assets or whatever it happens to be, and that when it comes time to claim that it's fast, it's easy, and it's simple, then they will love you every day of the week. And that's where bringing these worlds together is valuable, because the use of AI in context here is being able to achieve all of those things I just mentioned, deployed correctly, of course. And an AI strategy, any technology strategy, in fact, has to recognize what customers actually want. And I've said this in a number of forums, that in the end, as participants in the insurance industry, we imagine that people like buying insurance more than they do. It's not about the experience, it's about the value that they have of having that product, that feeling of protection, the things that they can do when we're on risk. And there's a lot of value in doing that better. And of course, the industry has tried to do it better for a long, long time, and we have dramatically improved. This is just the next step in doing even better using technology.
Yeah. And drilling into that a little bit, what has actually changed? Like, just to really dumb it down, like in terms of what has actually changed in the last 12 to 18 months, in your view?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, I think, because there are several different I suppose, adoption curves going on at once.
Yep.
Most of the general public and most insurers that have done anything in AI are familiar by now with sort of, it's funny to call it this, but classical generative AI, the kinds of things that you might get out of Copilot or ChatGPT. And don't get me wrong, those are very good, and there are still some very powerful capabilities you can get out of systems like that. Many people will be familiar with terms like retrieval augmented generation, the ability to take in a very large set of documents and ask and answer questions about that document almost instantly. And there was a slow start with that technology. There was a lot of hallucination in models. It's getting a lot better now. That's almost a solved problem. So we're now at the point where the kinds of things that an underwriter or a claims operator might have done on a large corpus of information can now be done instantaneously, and it dramatically accelerates that. But in the last 12 months particularly, and I think a lot of people by now will have heard the term agentic AI, this has really started to make its presence known. And I think there's still a lot of mystery around exactly what agentic AI is. People toss the word around all the time without really understanding what it means. And look, at the heart of it, it's actually not very complex. All it refers to is essentially a loop that the system goes through, the same exact generative models that we already had, breaking a complex problem down into steps, essentially a workflow, and then introspecting, asking a question of itself, have I solved the original problem that I was set, the task that I was set? That's not answering a question, it's about running through a process. And that's the point that we've got to now, where we're forced to reflect on, as we see the capabilities of this simple extension to the technology, but the power that it delivers, what analogs do we have for the things that they are now capable of within our businesses? The things that we do that are workflow driven, that are highly repeatable, but rely on the nuance of shift, of change, of source material and approach and technique, the things that humans have always been good at. It turns out that these systems are very good at that too. So the question is, can we have the thing that we've always loved, that people have done, and can we do some of that using this capability? And it's looking like the answer is yes.
I'm sure you hear this a little bit as well, and I think sometimes this pod works. I ask stupid questions. RPA and Agentic, they often get, well, I've used UiPath for the last 15 years, and UiPath's great, and I use an RPA, and it gives me this automated workflow. Can you say what's the difference? Like how is Agentic different to an RPA?
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, and there will be a lot of place for RPA tools going forward, and I strongly suspect, in fact, we know that RPA companies are extending into the agentic space. It's a natural marriage. RPA is extremely good at doing things that are not stochastic, that are predictable. So the classic case in point is connecting to a VT100 terminal into a mainframe environment, knowing that at row 30, column 40, there is a particular number that you have to get out that represents premium for policy that we've manually typed in, and that will be returned via an API back to the web so that we can do online quoting from a mainframe which was made before APIs existed. And that's fantastic. It's amazing that we can do that at all. It's amazing that it works. Full credit to the RPA companies and to the people that build on top of them. That's incredible. The difference with agentic AI is the nuance of behavior and flexibility that we didn't have in RPA. So the classic example here is that row 30, column 40 field that we get, for whatever reason somebody's gone in and changed a form, it's shifted down one. An RPA system will go and blindly grab the wrong value. An agentic system might be able to introspect upon the fact that what it's grabbed isn't the right value, and it might be able to spot the correct place that is. And that's a simple example, of course. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's one of the base behaviors. Something that a human would immediately identify as wrong if they were doing the task. That's why we've had people in certain tasks. It's that kind of thing that an agentic system can do, asking itself whether it's done the right thing, and if not, to try a different approach until it does. That's the power here. And it's being made known and felt in so many different areas already in less regulated space like software development. Particularly in the last 5 or 6 weeks, there have been some incredible examples of things that humans are extraordinarily good at, like complex software development, that it turns out these agentic systems are very good at as well, just because they keep hammering away at a problem until they solve it.
I actually saw a great article you put up on, just to double click on that, on software development. I know you've been in this space for a very long time in terms of as an engineer, and it seems that the something that didn't work 12 months ago, didn't work 6 months ago, didn't work 3 months ago, that speed of improvement specifically in software development is really accelerating. Can you touch on that and that article you put up and how that links into everything we've just spoken around this change in technology and expectations, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, as you said, I've been a software developer in some form or shape for, 40 years now, nearly. I think I wrote my first line of code at the age of 5 on a Commodore 64, going back a very long time now. I love software development. I love engineering. I love the feeling of creating something out of nothing. I think a lot of engineers do. Having said that, I was a very early adopter of generative AI powered software development. When I first noticed, like a lot of people did, that you could go to a model like GPT-3 long before ChatGPT existed and give it a small task to write a function that was 3 or 4 lines long, and it would give you a good guess at what that might look like. And it wasn't great. It looked like a hint of what might come, but of course we didn't know that then. It would do silly things like missing a semicolon at the end of the line, or misinterpreting what you're asking for and giving you something back that looked like code but wasn't really. And then sort of in 2022-ish, 2023, we could give basic tasks, things that might take a human 15 to 20 minutes to write, 10 to 15 lines of code of a function, and cast your eye over the result, and most of the time it was correct, and that's something that you could use in situ. And this sort of, let's call it generative AI assisted software development, lasted for quite some time, and some people sort of thought this would be the end state. We'd always be copying and pasting code back and forth, but humans would still be at the center of things. What's fascinating in the last 3 to 4 months, particularly with the advent of agentic coding tools, is that we've had this inversion of control between the human and the system, and humans using agentic tools like Codex or Cursor or Claude Code or GitHub Copilot have become much more like engineering managers. And that article that you referred to that I wrote before, I wanted in December to jump straight into the most complex thing that I could think of, probably the most complex software that exists, to look at how much human effort and how much machine effort was required to do things that were extraordinary. And I chose developing an operating system. There is a lot of complexity in building an operating system. I think we forget about that day to day because things like Windows or Mac OS are just there and they've always been there. But, that's something that took 40 years of development in the case of Windows and Mac OS. And the reason it did is because it's extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily large, and everything has to work all of the time. And it's an interesting analog as we start to look at other complex processes, other things in enterprise, and we'll get back to insurance in a moment. But what I've noticed is, as a result of this inversion of control, people are becoming much more like managers. They're saying what they want to happen and how that's been done before, a so-called plan. It sort of acts like the memory of the system, understanding how a problem should be approached. And then the system itself can not just write something, but prove that it works as well. And that's the difference here. That's that introspection that I mentioned before. Because there's no point in so-called, let's call it vibe coding. I think some people have heard that term. There's probably the equivalent of vibe coding in underwriting or in claims operations. This feels right. But proving that it's right, doing it, and then showing that it works, in the case of engineering, by writing test cases and running them and making sure that they work, and where they don't, fixing the underlying code and showing why you changed it. That's the true power here. And what I found remarkable about this space is that these systems can code and go through this sort of code, think, write test, run test, change code loop for hours and hours and hours. The longest I've had a system running without stopping is 27 hours. In fact, there are examples on the web of Cursor, who wrote an article about making a web browser this way, of running a swarm of agents for a week to output 3 million lines of code that's provably correct and functions. And it really makes you think that, 3 million lines of code would take a team of 10 to 15 people on the order of 12 to 13 years, something like that, to write, and maybe not even do a good job as Cursor did in that 1 week. And we're sort of forced to start thinking about, what does this mean for 2026 and 2027 and 2028? How are we going to start looking at this incredible power, defining the ecosystem of capabilities and behaviors required to do that, not just in software engineering, but in industry? And what is that going to mean for the balance we have between people and systems and agents, all of which will be in the mix? And what does that do to our organizations as we start to transform? And those are big picture questions. And it's not just about technology, it's about operations and finance, people.
Yeah, all of those things. And how is that thinking like affected a business like of QBE to say build versus buy versus partner, which is obviously something that I know it gets discussed at every boardroom. Like how has that change affected that question, and how's that maybe QBE thinking about that over 26?
Yeah, and look, it depends. It depends where we're
Mm-hmm.
building, buying, and partnering. Ultimately, I mean, I think that it would take a lot to wrest a large insurance company away from the tried and tested. And I think everyone's familiar with the phrase "no one ever got fired for choosing IBM." You know, there are equivalents in the insurance industries, and I'm not going to name drop any particular vendor, but there are reasons that decisions are made that way. So really the question that is going to be asked in a lot of boardrooms soon will be, yes, we can, and we've got evidence that we can make different choices than the ones we've made in the past, but the real thing that will be interrogated a lot is should we? And what are the implications of that? What are the implications of going alone? And I suspect we're going to start seeing this eaten away around the edge, the less material things, and not wanting to cast shade on any particular skill, but I mean a classic example is web-based distribution. So creating a quote flow for an online distributed insurance product used to be, still is, a very skilled task for a team of human beings. I am probably the world's worst UI developer. My sense of color and style and layout is to be feared, and in fact in many development teams I've been involved in, that's an area of code that people keep me away from intentionally. But as a result of generative AI and agentic AI, even I can create a quote flow that's beautiful and functional and effective and scalable. I think that's where we're going to start seeing the first sign of these things, where classically it would have been quite a long development cycle to even add a field or change the way that a product worked in terms of distribution, or even to add significant new features. Now I think we're starting to see signs that some insurers, some highly regulated companies are going to make different decisions about that kind of thing, and also about what they might do, because it's now dramatically cheaper and faster to do. And it's going to be very interesting to watch which components of technology stacks start to be replaced by this kind of approach.
Yeah, interesting. Can we go a little deeper here, Alex? I'd love to maybe go from the theoretical level to the practical level. And you are involved in kind of this implementation phase as well within the organization. Obviously, we don't have to share anything that's proprietary, but I would love to maybe just go a little bit deeper on terms of when insurers do get this right, what does the stack actually look like? People, process, tech, governance, just to give a bit of a framework of someone to go, actually, okay, like this is great in theory, but actually this is a practical example of you putting something in market and it delivering on the promise.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at the difference between working in an unregulated tech startup or a startup that doesn't create software for a regulated space and a company that does build software in a regulated space, or an insurer, obviously, that is regulated themselves, the actual technology implementation, hands-on keyboard code writing, is one of the smaller components, remarkably, of the actual process of getting something from product concept to something that's in market. And that's because it takes substantial discussion and demonstration of correctness and accuracy and security, not just to internal stakeholders, but to regulators, to say, I have my ISO 27001 cert, I've done my SOC 2 Type 2 audit, I'm using encryption in these specific ways, I have my servers hosted in this particular region where we can have data residency. All of those things take months and months and months, classically. Vibe coding an insurance platform is fantastic, but you've still got to go through all of those processes and proofs. And look, I would love to see regulators jump into the use of AI, maybe to start accelerating some of those pieces. We haven't got to that point yet, but it's important to recognize that if you are going to use AI at any point in product development in insurance, you need to have a very good governance regime, an AI standard and practice. And what that means is that because you are effectively introducing risk, I mean, let's face it, stochasticity, which is what AI is built on, is risk because it is randomness. When it comes down to it, it's randomness. Humans are no different. Humans can be reliable. They can also be unreliable. We have processes for validating the capabilities of a person. We call them certifications. We call them licenses to operate in areas like AFSLs. The use of AI will be no different. I think that we're going to see, as we mature the use of AI in industry, the ability and the requirement to certify the model that you are using for the safe use in particular functions and areas, be that software engineering or underwriting decisions or claims outcomes. And if you can prove that it works, then it's likely to be a substantial step up in those regulatory discussions where you say, I am using this model for this function with this level of human oversight and this level of governance. We're a long way, I think, as an industry and as a planet from doing that, but there are people starting to think in that direction. In fact, one of the companies that QBE Ventures invested in, called Snorkel, they're a California-based AI model development and data organization, has published leaderboards, including for the insurance industry, essentially looking at all of the open and closed source models and their ability across, I think it's 4,500 underwriting questions, whose answers were, through a collective of people who were experienced underwriters, shown to be certain things, and the model's ability to replicate that answer. And it's fascinating looking at sort of this stack ranking of all of the models and their capabilities. I think Claude Opus is the current winner. But when those models start to perform above a human baseline, above the level of correctness that humans in isolation manage to get, it forces us to ask certain questions, like, is it appropriate to purely have humans doing a particular thing, whatever that thing happens to be, if we can show that a system can do that better and faster? And I'm not going to have an opinion that I express right now on that, but it is an interesting question to ask. And I suspect, to go back to your earlier question, I suspect that as we start to look at how we govern the use of AI and AI-related technology in industry, it's going to be that kind of framework that helps us to make those decisions.
Super interesting. And is there any particular actual case study you can share? Any actual thing that you've been part of implementing and maybe some sort of ability to show that yes, we did this thing and it worked?
Yeah, and look, there are some great reference examples in insurance. I mean, even away from QBE.
It could be just in market you've seen. It doesn't have to be QBE specifically.
I mean, if you look at Allstate, it's very interesting. They partnered with Microsoft, with the Azure AI platform. And what's fascinating, and it goes back to what you were just saying before, that they spoke not just about incredible technology power, the underlying models which Microsoft largely procures from OpenAI, though increasingly recently Anthropic as well, that the Azure AI platform, and I think Microsoft has played their cards very well here, is built around verifiability and governance and observability. And that's what major companies want. They don't just want an answer, they want evidence that that answer is correct. And they want the system to show it's working. And that's another fascinating thing that Agentic AI brings. It's not just about the answer, it's about the way that you get to the answer. If you go to a human underwriter and say, how did you make this underwriting decision? They'll walk you through the process and they'll show you all of the material they considered and their lifetime of experience that they've used to understand the shipping of lithium batteries as cargo through the Suez Canal. One of my favorite examples that one of our teams of underwriters shared with me, incredible knowledge in these people. But systems like the ones that Microsoft has created and the frameworks they've created around them can replicate this experience. Being able to say to the system, we have had a regulatory inquiry about this particular claims outcome. How did you make that decision? And if it can show you that, and you can show that a human looked at that, and a quorum of people looked at 10% of all claims decisions and they agreed with them, and that's how you govern that, and that was acceptable to your regulator, that's fantastic. But it depends on that observability. And observability is probably the most important component of the safe use of AI in industry, because without it, we're just taking something at face value. It's very difficult to trust, just as much as it would be difficult to trust the roll of a dice to make claims outcomes.
Yeah, totally. And flipping that to the other side, things are going to fail. New technologies, when you're trying things aren't going to work. Is there anything, again, it doesn't have to be specifically QBE, but just market that you've seen, which is something that looked really promising on paper, theoretically, but it's failed. And maybe that's changed. Maybe something failed 18 months ago isn't now failing. Just kind of interested in how, because I think that's something that we hear a bunch from our customers and execs we talk to is, well, I tried this and it failed. And so there's a fear of going back to it. Can you just maybe bring some examples to that and maybe kind of bring to life how it's important to go back to these things over time?
Yeah. And look, I think it's important to recognize that these technologies are new to everybody. There will be repeatedly things that are wrong, and it's not that there's anything wrong with the tech, it's that our understanding of the impact of that tech is misinformed as a result of lack of the insight and the benefit of hindsight. So a classic example is that everybody sort of looked at what chatbots like ChatGPT could do going back 2 or 3 years now, and the first gut response for everybody was to add a chatbot to their platform. Let's add a little button in the bottom right, and people can talk to it, and they can ask and answer questions. And if you look at the analytics behind this, in 99% of cases, people don't use those features at all. They don't want to ask a question in plain English about something when they can just go and press the button that's always been there to do the same thing. That comes down to a misunderstanding and maybe a misnaming of things like a chatbot. ChatGPT probably doesn't help in this. The biggest change, I think, that we're starting to see now, and the correction of that course that maybe we weren't going down the right way on, was that we thought that these systems would be purely something that could answer a question that we thought might take 2 or 3 minutes to do for ourselves. And the value add of that wasn't high enough to justify completely changing the approach that you took to something. What we're starting to see the impact of now is these complex things that either humans can only do one of at once, and therefore, you have one underwriter that can maybe look through 3 submissions a day, and that limits the amount of premium you can bind, to being able to have that one underwriter managing a team of agents that can do 100 submissions a day that they can still review and certify. It's that kind of benefit that we're starting to see. And as people start to build that into their workflow, we're seeing a lot more demand and appreciation for the value that can have than we might have done before. And I've said this in many different forums. The thing that's important to underline here is that this doesn't result in there being fewer people in the equation. It results in genuine growth. We can do more now with the same level of quality that we could because of the uptick in benefit and value that we see from the use of these systems deployed appropriately. And that's not a button in the bottom right of the screen. That's the equivalent of an employee that talks to you in the same tools that you're used to, comes back to you in Teams and says, I've looked at this submission and here is my decision. This is what I've used to base my decision on, and this is what action we should take, be it bind, decline, refer to another underwriter. Except instead of waiting 2 hours, you might be able to get that in 30 seconds, and your experienced human underwriter can spend their time looking at the decisions these systems have made and produce the same quality they always did, but bind 6 to 7 times more premium than they could. And I think when you sort of look at these two things in contrast, the benefit to the organization isn't a new shiny gizmo in the screen. It's the fact that your operations as an organization can be transformed because of that capability that's been delivered. And it's very difficult to overstate how important that is.
Yeah, I think we just spoken about there really, which is both top line and bottom line growth, right? You're seeing kind of this potential for revenue growth and a potential for improve profitability, but obviously you're taking a bunch of these things up to boards a lot, and I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening to this are thinking that's great, I'm going to do these things, but I want to be able to discuss it in a metric that actually matters. Like when you're talking to your leaders and you're kind of deciding whether actually something's working, is there a single metric that is the most important one, or is there a group of metrics that really can put the case together to say this is a thing we should push forward with?
Look, I think the baseline that we have to use at the moment is the equivalent to human skill and capability. We know, as an insurance industry and as a planet in many different industries, what good looks like. Experienced people are very good at identifying high quality. And they can say that this is working, and here's the evidence for the fact that it's working, and this is why we trust this person, this team, this company to do that thing. it's very important, I think, to not get lost in the power of AI as a technology to the point where we forget what we're actually trying to do. And there's no point in introducing any technology, whatever it happens to be it AI or a database, an analytics tool, anything, if it's going to meaningfully impact the outcome and the capability in a negative way. So I think, at least for the next several years, every time a technology comes in, yes, it will be considered on cost terms. And, if you go to any boardroom across the world right now and they're being forced to make a decision like, should we deploy Copilot or not to our organization? Yes, it looks very expensive at first glance, and it is very expensive. But being able to measure the impact of that is the important piece. And if you can say, as a result of the deployment of Copilot, people are spending 10 hours a month less searching for emails or trying to summarize meeting minutes or whatever it happens to be, then you've got a metric you can rely on. I'm a big believer in running things in shadow mode. So deploying the shiny new agentic AI tool in shadow mode, in the background, behind the scenes of underwriting decisions is the classic example. Being able to get the humans to do the same task for 12 months and get the system in the background, with or without those people's knowledge, making a decision on bind, decline, price, and then in a year, looking back and saying, who did better? Was it the people by themselves? Was it the people with the systems? Was it the systems by themselves? It's that kind of thing that people are starting to do now and can do as a result of these tools, because the systems can literally run a process end to end. And when you can show that we're getting better loss ratio outcomes as a result of decisions the system made, either in the positive or the negative, than the human alone teams, that's when we're forced to sit down and look and say, well, maybe we need to start inverting, to use the word from before, and start to promote the people to that managerial position and let the systems make more of the first line decisions themselves. And of course, that introduces all of the regulatory complexity that we mentioned before and governance. There's a lot of things you need to get right. So over the next 12 months, I suspect that the insurance regulators of the world, the corporate regulators of the world, are going to start getting a lot more hands-on in the AI strategies of regulated organizations as they go down that journey, as they start making the decisions about how they'll use AI, doing it in a safe and governed way that the public trust is of course important, but we're at that stage now where we can at least start thinking about how to make that decision.
And you touched on partnerships there a little bit, or in terms of kind of how you can start to do these kind of shadow implementations and that kind of thing. Like, how do you think there's any obviously organizations like yourselves and like lots of others are considering how to partner with agentic platforms, with software platforms that have layered kind of AI and agentic stuff on top? Has that kind of partnership model changed at all when you are thinking about bringing these, doing partnerships with these businesses at an enterprise level, like a QBE or any large insurer? Is there any kind of change here in terms of how we're thinking going from this kind of experimentation phase into this execution that we think is happening over the last kind of 12, 18 months? If you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I certainly think the answer is yes, but it's nuanced.
Yep.
Look, I have the greatest of respect for people that work on core insurance systems because it's an immensely difficult job. With every passing year, incumbent systems tend to age in place more. The skill sets that are required to maintain them, particularly in things like COBOL and PRG, get harder and harder. I've worn that pain. I've seen the drain it causes on teams and people. I would say that 90% of the time of the average technologist working in the average incumbent insurer is spent either keeping the lights on an increasingly aged system or in very complex transformation programs, which is sort of undertaking this enterprise archaeology of figuring out how everything works in the tech stack over here and then delivering it to the new and shiny tech stack over here. What that means is there's not a lot of bandwidth left in an incumbent large insurer to go and experiment with the shiny new toys in the corner. And frankly, look, 10 years ago, I don't think there was a lot of justification to go and look at the new and shiny because it wasn't enough of a step change to justify distracting a large team from the task they had at hand, which, as we've discussed, was very complex already, especially considering the expense of distracting those people. The difference that we have now is that I think it's plain as daylight to everybody everywhere that AI and agentic AI will dramatically transform the way that we undertake our businesses, whatever that business happens to be. And the cost of missing out now is going to be more significant than the cost of not participating. And I think what we're starting to see is not distracting those teams. The work they do is still important and they'll have to continue to do that, but bringing in a younger organization that has experimentation and rapid iteration as part of their DNA into the edge of an organization, combined with a sensible data strategy. I mean, in the end, you can't really do AI or agentic AI unless you have access to data and to systems and to events. So that's a not negotiable. But then bringing in a younger company to make it possible to do this experiment, to understand what you might have now that this technology has arrived, it's extremely important. And increasingly, we're seeing very, very large organizations, the behemoths of the insurance industry, partnering with much younger, much smaller, much less developed companies. And I don't think that's ever really been the case before. 5 years ago, we would have almost certainly thought a lot harder before we made that kind of decision. Now, however, most of the agentic capability particularly is coming out of companies that in some cases didn't exist a year and a half ago. And that's because they built their company from scratch to be good at these things. And frankly, we want some of that.
And how does ventures, and specifically like a CVC, how do you ventures fit into that world, right? Maybe it's a bit of a leading question, but I think kind of it feels like ventures being an important part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, even in the world of ventures and the way that we partner with the core of QBE, any CVC unit is like this. There are certain non-negotiables. And, getting past the risk and the privacy and the governance and the legal and the procurement, security, all of those things don't go anywhere. But the approach that QBE Ventures has taken through our so-called Lighthouse program, you can have a look at this at qbe.com/ventures. Lighthouse is about making sure that the people responsible for those things are available to quickly go through the processes in a lightweight form that I just mentioned with a younger company to prove if a thing is going to be valuable. So look, no company that's created a new whiz-bang agentic AI capability that can automate large amounts of claims is going to want to spend a year in a procurement process going through a 70-page services agreement, with a bunch of lawyers. Frankly, in most cases, they'll just say, no, we're not interested. But if you can say to them, in 3 weeks, you can show us, starting at day one, exactly what it is that your thing can do, they'll very likely be interested. And that's what Lighthouse is designed to do. I know many other corporate venture capital and innovation units and insurers and banks have done something similar. The intent here is to be able to point to something that's real, not just in the hypothetical, here's a slide deck that says this company can do this thing, but in the real. Here is the thing that in 3 weeks we have done to transform the way that we do underwriting for, lithium batteries shipped through the Suez Canal. When you can see and touch and prod that and say, well, it works and the people that do this job today like it and they can put their time and attention to something that's more of a valuable use of their human skills and ingenuity, it becomes something that looks like it has a shorter pathway to production. And it does in most cases. It's a way of informing boards what's real, what is actually going to change things. Or potentially, in 3 weeks, we've shown that this thing won't transform something and we haven't wasted a year. We've wasted 3 weeks, which is dramatically better. So it's about being able to make sensible decisions based on evidence. And there's a lot of hype in AI and agentic AI, so much hype. And look, I'm very familiar with the hype world, working in both ventures, and I founded a Bitcoin company once. I kind of been at the center of the nature of hype and technology. Cutting through that hype is super important. And there's a lot of real value in AI, but there's a lot of things that people overstate the value of, particularly now. Differentiating between the two is probably the most important thing that an organization like QBE Ventures does.
Note to every insurer listening: get yourself a venture unit so you can cut through the hype. Now, Alex, I'm just going to ask you one last question to wrap up, if that's okay. And I think I would love to know if you're an insurance leader listening to this. What is just the single one thing in the next 30 days that they should be doing at the start of 2026?
There's a phrase that I remember from the 80s that's very relevant now, and American listeners will remember this more because it was on American television. But there was a thing in the 80s where they would get a celebrity on the news and they would say, it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? The thing now that we have to think about is it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your data is? Data is still the most important thing in an insurance company, in a bank, in any major organization. You cannot take advantage of any of the things that we've spoken about today unless the core of your operation is accessible to newer technology. That means making sure that you don't have to think about the one person that knows where a particular piece of data is, and it requires an arcane technology setup that only that person in the corner knows about and can do. Making sure that everything is accessible to younger companies that don't have COBOL skills, that you can send an event into the core of your organization and without having to know that it goes through twists and turns of RPA systems, it just works. If you get that right, you are very well placed to take advantage of agentic AI and everything that comes next. If you don't get that right, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So making sure you get the fundamentals right was and still is the most important thing.
CIOs listening, you've heard it. Get the data straight. Alex, look, thank you so much. I'm sure if people don't follow your content, you should jump on LinkedIn or jump on X and follow Alex's content, because he is as a stream of good thinking out there. And if he doesn't know it, he kind of brings in a bunch of experts who do. So Alex, so thanks for all the content you put out. Thanks for your time today. It's been so insightful, and we'll keep in touch.